Shawn "Diddy" Combs could be facing new charges in his criminal case in New York as more victims of his alleged misconduct continue to come forward with claims in civil lawsuits, and a grand jury could be convened in the Southern District of New York. We'll take a closer look at what this means for the disgraced rapper and analyze the implications with a current law professor. Welcome to the program, brought to you by our channel. The dramatic news surrounding the legal saga of Shawn "Diddy" Combs continues to unfold as he finds himself embroiled in one scandal after another in various courts. Could he be facing new charges related to criminal conspiracy and government-related sexual offenses? According to reports, a grand jury in New York may soon hear new evidence in Combs' criminal case. In fact, attorney Ariel Mitchell told NBC News on Wednesday that a male client of hers will testify before the grand jury in the Southern District of New York today, and a source familiar with the proceedings confirmed to NBC that a man is expected to testify. Grand jury proceedings, of course, are private. We often never know exactly what happens behind those closed doors. But if a superseding indictment is filed, it could mean new or upgraded charges, or a combination of both. This is a significant development. To recap, here's what the original indictment filed in September outlined. The defendant engaged in a pattern of persistent and widespread abuse toward women and other individuals. This abuse included verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual mistreatment. As part of this abusive pattern, Combs manipulated women into participating in carefully orchestrated sexual performances with male sex workers. At times, Combs and others acting at his direction arranged for women and sex workers to be brought to Combs' residence. Combs secured women's involvement by, among other means, providing and distributing stimulants to them, controlling their careers, leveraging financial support, and threatening to withdraw that support, as well as using intimidation and violence. The criminal conspiracy charge stems from the notion that this was a criminal enterprise led or directed by Shawn Combs, with a complete structure in place to support his alleged criminal activities. He is also accused of forcing victims to engage in commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And he is further accused of transporting individuals for the purpose of prostitution. More notably, prosecutors state that Combs used his money, power, and influence to orchestrate freak-offs, essentially group sex parties, which involved hiring male sex workers, providing drugs, recording these sexual acts, and again using force, fraud, and coercion to achieve his desires. By the way, I'm talking about the law, right? Yes, indeed, law and crime. I'm discussing legal rulings and judicial decisions, but right now, I have a particular piece of information that has led to a significant shift. Why is that? Because now you can legally participate in predicting who will win the 2024 election. That's right, it's legal because Sidebar's sponsor Kai went to court and won legal approval for election outcome prediction transactions for the first time in 100 years. So, not only can you predict who will win the 2024 presidential election, but with Key, you can also predict which party will control the House and Senate, as well as the outcomes in key states. This is very timely for what's coming up next week, right? And it's not just politics. You can also predict other future events, like whether Taylor Swift will win Artist of the Year on Spotify, or what the Rotten Tomatoes score for upcoming movies like Gladiator 2 will be. Personally, I think that movie will score over 85% and be a huge success. But there are plenty of other surprising options for you to explore and predict. Returning to Ariel Mitchell, who has represented multiple clients in a series of civil lawsuits filed against Shawn Combs since his home was first searched in March, sparking rumors of a federal investigation. One of her most recent clients is a woman from California named Jane Doe, who reported that she was assaulted by Combs in 2018, but managed to escape and ran to a neighbor for help. She also filed a police report, but stated that nothing substantial came of it. Anjanette Levy, host of LA Crime's Crime Fix, interviewed Ariel Mitchell a few weeks ago to learn more about her client, the allegations she has made, and any evidence that might corroborate her testimony. According to Mitchell, this woman, Jane Doe, mentioned another woman named Christina Coram. If you've been following the Shawn Combs story, you'll recognize this name, as she has been alleged in at least one lawsuit to be Combs' right-hand person, ensuring he had everything he wanted, including sex workers. She has been compared to Ghislaine Maxwell, the infamous associate of Jeffrey Epstein. However, it's important to clarify that no criminal charges have been filed against Christina Coram, and she has not been mentioned in any government documents in this criminal case. Here's what Ariel Mitchell said about her client's connection to Christina Coram in the interview with Anjanette Levy. She also identified Christina Coram, whom Mr. Combs referred to as KK, and mentioned in some interviews. When he accepted the BET award, he thanked Cassie for supporting him during difficult times, but he also started by mentioning KK. She said she didn't initially know who this woman was, but after seeing photos circulating online, she recognized her as the person who was there that night. This is the person she described to the police, but she didn't know her name. She said that the woman named Christina Coram began joking about sex trafficking, saying that my client would be very valuable on the market. This made her uncomfortable. After having a drink, she started feeling dizzy, and then Mr. Combs sexually assaulted her with an object and directed another man to continue assaulting her, while Mr. Combs stood in the corner, gratifying himself. This sounds very similar to what has been alleged in Combs' freak-off events. Ariel Mitchell stated that she has spoken with several others who have similar stories, but she has not taken them on as clients due to the necessary vetting process. She needs credible evidence such as witnesses, photos, or other forms of proof to ensure there is a legitimate basis for filing a complaint. Ariel also mentioned that there are individuals who have called in with similar stories, but they are not U.S. citizens. They are foreigners who were trafficked into Miami by Mr. Combs. Because she cannot verify their stories, she is unable to take them on as clients. One of her male clients is expected to testify before the grand jury. If a superseding indictment is issued, this could impact the current trial date of May 5, 2025, with new charges and evidence. This process may take time, involving the search for witnesses and experts to prepare for the case. It's possible that if there is a superseding indictment, the trial date could be postponed. Throughout this time, Combs has firmly maintained his innocence. And to be clear, he has not been found liable in any criminal or civil cases related to sexual misconduct. Combs' legal team has stated that they look forward to presenting their case in court and have indicated that Combs himself may testify in his defense to share his side of the story. We'll discuss that further later on. The government always has the right to issue a superseding indictment to add charges or upgrade existing charges. Of course, we won't know until the grand jury report or any indictment is released who testified and what their testimony entailed. But is that a possibility? It's always a possibility. Could we know who testified? I think it depends. If the grand jury report or indictment names the complainant or alleged victim, often referred to as the victim, then we might find out. If they were a minor at the time of the incident, they are usually referenced by initials or an alias. I'm curious about what new charges might be added, or if certain charges might be upgraded or modified. We'll discuss that further later. But I think the timing here is interesting. Do you think the prosecution knew about what could be this new evidence before the new lawsuits were filed? Did they always know about it and wait to present it to the grand jury? Why wasn't it introduced from the beginning? Remember, he's currently facing 3 charges, but additional charges could still be added. The timing is quite interesting, truly interesting. I don't want to speculate further because clearly we don't know the exact details of the investigation, nor do we know the extent and frequency of communication between federal prosecutors from the Southern District of New York and the attorneys handling the civil cases. However, I don't think it's unusual for a criminal investigation to be informed by information from civil lawsuits. Discoveries made in civil cases can help guide a criminal investigation or influence the prosecution's decisions on how to proceed or whether to pursue charges. It's possible that the civil investigation began first and was then referred to federal prosecutors or aided them in making decisions, or vice versa. A complainant or plaintiff in a civil case may not have been ready to cooperate with the prosecution or testify before the grand jury, and might have felt more comfortable pursuing a civil remedy first. This makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Why do we have charges against Shawn Combs? Because of the civil lawsuits. It's clear that Cassandra Ventura is, if not the key witness, then certainly an important witness for the prosecution's case. When reading the indictment, it seems her allegations make up a significant portion of it. So I think this is a clear example of how civil lawsuits may have triggered the criminal investigation and the criminal charges. You can call me skeptical, I don't know what you'd call me, but I wonder, tell me if I'm completely off base here. Is there something else going on right now? The idea that Shawn Combs is actively fighting for bail, trying to secure his release, and pushing back against pre-trial detention. I've done other sidebar episodes on this before, Professor, and I honestly think he's made some pretty compelling arguments to show he deserves release. He's proposed an attractive bail package and countered many of the prosecution's points. He's even referenced Mike Jeffries, the former CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch, who was also charged with trafficking in New York and was granted bail. I won't go through all the arguments again, but I wonder if there's any motivation for the prosecutors to fast-track a superseding indictment to ensure he isn't released pre-trial. What do you think? I don't know, but that could very well be part of their strategy. However, I'd say that the purpose of bail is to ensure the defendant's presence at trial. It's meant to make sure that if there's any intent to flee or skip proceedings, the defendant has a strong reason to appear and participate in court proceedings or hearings. I think you're absolutely right in saying that, in Combs' case, he's invested a substantial amount in his defense, and if granted bail, he'd be in a better position to engage in building his defense strategy, planning cross-examination theories, and working closely with his legal team. These bail requests have been taken to the Second Circuit Federal Court of Appeals and were denied. To be clear, I'm not sure if the Second Circuit has outright denied them. I think they put it on hold because he wants to argue before a new judge, Judge Subramanian, who is now overseeing this case. So it's possible it could come back. The court has put the appeal on hold pending the new judge's decision, but he has been denied twice. I understand you, but I view this issue from a different angle. The prosecutors have emphasized that he has contacted witnesses and consider him a threat if he's out on bail. From their perspective, if he's detained, more people may feel comfortable coming forward with evidence, additional witnesses, and more alleged victims. These individuals might feel safer testifying if they know that Shawn Combs isn't free. That makes me wonder if they're essentially saying, we need to keep him detained because if he's in custody, we can gather more evidence for our case. I'm not sure if this is a reasonable concern, but it's something I'm considering. I appreciate how you framed it from another perspective, that the prosecutors might be opposing the bail request on behalf of potential victims and witnesses, arguing that his release could impact their willingness to participate and testify before the grand jury, engage in prep sessions, and appear before the jury when the case goes to trial. As a former prosecutor, I'm very hesitant to suggest that prosecutors would be inclined to add on and keep stacking charges just to keep the defendant detained. I don't think that's an appropriate use of the bail system or the pretrial detention system. However, I do agree that if there is intimidation, retaliation, or any form of interference with witnesses, the prosecutors would certainly use that as a basis to oppose a bail request. Combs has denied this, but that's a separate conversation. Let me ask you this. If there were a male victim alleging abuse by Shawn Combs, what charges could potentially be upgraded? Would it be an additional trafficking charge or perhaps more allegations to strengthen the organized crime charge? One thing we've wondered from the beginning, because I've been following Shawn Combs' story over the past year, is that I was quite surprised there were no charges involving minors. Even before the indictment, there were allegations that he may have enticed minors. Since he was indicted, we've seen a wave of civil lawsuits where people claim he sexually abused them when they were underage. I don't know if this witness falls into that category, but I'm curious. If there's at least one other accuser coming forward to testify, what potential charges might we see in a superseding indictment? Remember that any charges Shawn Combs is currently facing are gender neutral, and to my knowledge, in most states, and certainly under federal law, charges of sexual abuse, sexual violence, rape, or sexual assault do not depend on the gender or gender identity of the victim. So if this male witness experienced the same type of forcible sexual activity alleged by other witnesses in this case, the same charges would apply in an indictment and would include a male victim. This is gender neutral, and it's very possible that if this is part of a criminal enterprise, additional charges could be added to the racketeering count. I think it's very important for us to note, and for the public to understand, that sexual assault charges are gender neutral, and male or male-identifying victims can be just as much victims of sexual assault as female victims. We also need to be clear that not every instance of sexual assault qualifies as a federal charge. It must align with a federal charge category. If someone claims they were sexually assaulted by Shawn Combs in 2010 or someone else says they were assaulted in 1995, how could these events rise to a federal crime? From what I understand of the indictment materials, it's actually the federal commerce aspect of these activities that establish the basis for federal charges. Whenever activity crosses state lines, it impacts what we call federal commerce, which then grants jurisdiction to federal courts and prosecutors to bring criminal charges. So, if there's a witness or a paid sex worker traveling from New Jersey to New York, from Virginia to New York, or from one state to another within the U.S., this would be considered interstate commerce and would create federal jurisdiction, unless the charges shift to involve the solicitation of minors or similar allegations. Let me ask this. You don't have to go back to the grand jury if you just have additional evidence supporting a charge. For example, racketeering makes up about 80% of the indictment. and it includes references to forced labor, sex trafficking, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction. But they don't specify individual instances, nor do they name alleged victims or witnesses. If you have additional evidence, you don't necessarily have to go back to the grand jury to include it. It doesn't have to be a new charge, just additional evidence for an existing charge. They could simply call it an amended indictment with supplemental information, correct? I think you're right about that. Remember, the grand jury proceeding is essentially a preliminary hearing to decide whether there's enough evidence to bring the case to trial, and the entirety of the prosecution's discovery may not be presented, and certainly doesn't have to be presented, to the grand jury. This could mean that when the discovery process begins, when the prosecution's materials and investigative reports are handed over to the defense, there may be much more information in the discovery packet provided to the defense than was presented to the grand jury. So you're absolutely correct. There's no need for a superseding indictment if it's just additional evidence on the same charges or regarding the same victims already presented to the grand jury. Do you think it's possible that the prosecutors had the ability to charge Shawn Combs with more counts back in September but chose not to? Perhaps wanting to wait for a superseding indictment? And why might they do that? I think that's possible, yes. There's always a strategic decision involved in these cases. Would it make sense to do everything at once and present all the witnesses together, along with pursuing all charges at the same time? Perhaps. But trials and investigations are organic, ever-evolving processes. So while it may have been the prosecutor's intent to have a complete case file in September, if the investigation is growing and more people are willing to come forward and share their experiences, that could create a need for a superseding indictment. If the grand jury comes back, reviews this new evidence, and finds there is probable cause, enough evidence to move forward with charges, when would we find out? How quickly would this process happen if he were to actually face a superseding indictment? I have to respond in classic law professor style. It depends, it depends. This all hinges on how quickly the grand jury receives the evidence, how long they deliberate, and when they decide to issue an indictment. It also depends on the prosecutor's decision on when to make this information public. Could this happen very quickly, within a few days, or even next week? Absolutely possible. Could it take several months? That's also possible. So, we really don't have a specific timeline. If federal charges involving minors come into play, I think this entire case will change. I believe his defense strategy would also shift because much of the defense he seems to be presenting now is centered on consent. Everything was voluntary, there was no trafficking, no coercion. If we consider that the first alleged victim is Cassandra Ventura, and he's saying, "She was my girlfriend, of course I'd take her places, and we had a consensual relationship," he may be arguing that everything was consensual. But if minors are involved, that changes everything, doesn't it? Exactly, this would change things significantly. I think there could be evidence the defense might try to use to cross-examine witnesses who have filed civil suits, as their credibility might be questioned. Anytime a witness has something to gain or profit from the trial's outcome, that can indicate potential bias. If these witnesses were minors at the time of the alleged abuse, they might be cross-examined on any civil claims they're currently pursuing. Another point to keep in mind, however, is that prosecuting child abuse cases, especially cases involving delayed disclosure, can be very challenging due to the passage of time, potential memory lapses, or the lack of physical evidence. The media attention surrounding this prosecution could impact victims' decisions on whether to come forward. This shifts the defense strategy, but it also makes it more challenging for the prosecution to proceed with the case when victims may have been minors at the time of the alleged abuse. This is a very important point, and as we've discussed before, if these minors were drugged, it could affect their ability to recall events accurately. Thank you all for joining us. We truly appreciate it. We look forward to having you back as this case progresses. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.